Judges chapter 16. We've been looking at the life of Samson for the last several weeks. Today we finish the life of Samson, chapter 16. Now, I think when you look at Samson's life, you see someone who from his early years had God's hand upon him. We're told that Samson, before he was ever born, had a calling on his life. It tells us that his mom and dad were unable to conceive a child, and an angel shows up and says to his mom that she was going to bear a child, and that child was going to be a deliverer. And so Samson comes, and it tells us at the end of chapter 14 that he grew, and the Spirit of God was upon him. You just kind of think about, someone who has had all the right upbringing, all the right influences in his life. He brought up in a godly home, brought up with, all of the things that would set him up for success in the future. But Samson had a problem. Samson was determined to let his natural instincts, his natural desires, dictate his choices in life. And it's one of the tragedies of the Bible. Because you got a man here who had so much potential. And he ended so sad. It's also interesting that Samson, and we kind of looked at it last week. We saw it as we going through. He wanted this woman to be his wife, and all of that turned into a fiasco. And he ended up beating up a bunch of Philistines, killing a bunch of Philistines as a result of it. And God was even using some of those things to accomplish his purposes, and Samson is having great victories. But somehow he equated those victories to God's not caring about what he was going to do. Somehow Samson was to justify in his mind that, God's still blessing me even though I'm doing those things that I know are wrong, and somehow I can continue to do those things that are wrong, and God's still going to bless me. And I shared with you guys, I think that's one of the dangers, that's one of the tactics of the devil. He wants you to think that you can get away with sin, or God doesn't really, care whether we live in rebellion or our flesh rules our life. And Samson becomes an incredible picture for us. Because Samson didn't learn the lesson. He just kept going back. Now, notice verse 1 of chapter 16. And we did cover a couple of those verses, but let's go this just a way of review. Look at verse 1. Now Samson went to Gaza and saw a harlot there, and he went into her. And when the Gazites were told, Samson has come here, they surrounded the place, and they lied in wait for him all night at the gate of the city. And they were quiet all night, saying, in the morning, when it's daylight, we will kill him. And Samson laid low till midnight, and he arose at midnight, took hold of the doors of the gate of the city, and the two gateposts, pulled them up, bar and all, put them on his shoulders, and carried them to the top of the hill that faces Hebron. Now, Samson somehow gets divinely warned. Somehow he has this instinct that, if we stick around here, this isn't going to end well. So Samson at midnight, sneaks out of the house. He takes the gates, because at night they would close the gates. It was a way of securing the city so that the enemy didn't come by night and attack. He closes the gates, and they're thinking, man, we got Samson trapped. But Samson takes the bars of the gate and it puts them on his shoulder. And he walks up a hill. Now, I don't know, but I remember as a child, my mom would read me the little Bible stories. And one of those pictures was Samson with his gates. And I remember, looking at it just because they had Samson all buff, kind of like Arnold Schwarzenegger. And Samson just there walking, he's just walking up the hill, and he's got these gates. But, you don't know as a child that Samson had just been hanging out with a prostitute the night before. I don't know if that's really the picture you want to give your kids. Right? Look, God delivered him from hanging out with a prostitute. But here was the deal. He was there with a harlot, and somehow as he's walking away from that, escaped it without any consequences. He got away with it in his own mind. And so Samson's thinking, man, I got this invincibility to my life. I'm never going to get caught. The enemy's never going to catch me. God's with me. God's going to take care of me. I can do anything, and I'm not going to ever have to pay a price. We see that play out in verse 4. Now watch what happens. And afterward, it happened that he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek. Now that's the first time that word is used of any of Samson's affairs. He loved a woman. It was never anything to do with love. It had everything to do with lust. It had everything to do with passion. That it was what he saw with his eyes that dictated how Samson was going to, react, the choices he was going to make. And it says that he loved a woman, and in his mind, I think he probably thought he did. I'm in love with her. Her name was Delilah. Now, Delilah has a few different interpretations. When you look up the name Delilah, one of them is a devotee or a temple prostitute. And you really, after looking at Samson's life, you don't put it past him at this point. The other one was that she was, her name literally means to weaken or to impoverish. So, Delilah, probably got to really consider whether you want to name your child Delilah. To weaken or to impoverish. And it's exactly what Delilah does to Samson. She weakens him. The strongest man in the whole country, and a woman is able to take him down. And it's interesting that this woman, Delilah, catches his eye. She's got his attention. All of the Philistines kind of take notice that Samson's over there visiting Delilah. And so they go and make a deal with Delilah. Notice what it says there in verse 5. And the lords of the Philistines came up to her, and he said to her, entice him and find out where his great strength lies, and by what means we may overpower him, that we may bind him to afflict him, and every one of us will give you 1,100 pieces of silver. That's a pretty good proposition. If you use your powers, Delilah, to find out two things: where his great strength lies, and by what means we may overpower him. Now, I think just from that question, you can kind of come to a couple of conclusions. Samson didn't look the part. They didn't know where his strength lied. If he looked like Arnold, then they would have known where his great strength lies. He was someone who didn't fit the bill of being that strong, that powerful. I kind of picture Samson as, someone pretty scrawny. Because they're confused. How did he get all that strength? The guy doesn't look that strong. How's he carrying gates up hills? How's he wiping out all these Philistines? How's he, tearing up the whole community? How's Samson doing all that? He don't have that kind of power on his own. And you and I know that his power wasn't from him. His power was from the Lord. God had given him great power. It was God's Spirit that had given him great power. It wasn't Samson's strength, it was God's strength. And it's interesting that they come to Delilah and say, look, this is what we want you to do. We want you to entice him for us. Guys, that's how the enemy works. He's always wanting to entice us. He's always wanting to trap us. He's always looking for what bait we'll take in order to get us outside of God's plan so that we're now following his plan. He's an enticer. It tells us in the book of Ephesians, chapter 6, in the 10th verse, it says this. It says, we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers and rulers of darkness. And he says, stand therefore. And this is the word he uses. Because, doing all these things, put on the full armor of God that you may withstand the wiles of the devil. The wiles. The attacks. The enticing that the devil wants to put in front of you so that you get taken out of God's plan for your life. And the whole picture is that he's very wily. He studies you. He knows, where your tendencies are. He knows where your weaknesses are. And he's always looking for someone who's willing to entice you toward those weaknesses. It's exactly what the enemy does. He wants to entice. It tells us in the book of 1 Peter chapter 5, in the 8th verse, it says this, be sober and be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. That's what the devil does. He wants to entice. And he will recruit anybody that's willing to be a party in that, to entice you. I remember Pastor Rawl early in the ministry when I was, there under Pastor Rawl. He would always tell us, look, guys, you got to be careful because, girls are going to hit on you. If you're serving the Lord, the girls are going to hit on you. And he says, understand something. It's not because you're good looking. Because the devil's just looking to take you out. You have to be careful. You have to make sure that it's the Lord. Don't get enticed so that the enemy can come along and use that to disqualify you, to remove you from God's purpose and God's will for your life. And, and it's interesting because the enemy has all kinds of agents to work for him. A lot of willing and able soldiers that are willing to do Satan's bidding. Delilah is one of them. Because she hears, there's a proposition here. If I find out where his great strength lies, I find out by what means he can be overpowered, then I'm going to hit the lottery. I'm going to be wealthy. I'm going to be able to retire early. And so we find in verse 6. So Delilah said to Samson, please, honey pie, tell me where your great strength lies, and with what you may be bound to afflict you. Well, I mean, I don't think her intent was hidden, was it? She was pretty upfront. She was pretty bold. You know, the enemy doesn't hide what he wants to do. I think that's just, when I was reading that, going, man, she had no care to try to deceive. She was like, let me tell you, I want to kill you. I want to know how I can kill you. I want to know where the strength that you possess comes from so that I can remove that strength from you and then you can be afflicted. It's not a secret that Satan wants to kill you. It's not something that, you know, there's like, man, I had no idea that's what he wanted to do. No, it's pretty plain. God tells you over and over. The enemy doesn't even care if you know. He just wants to kill you. And you would think that if you kind of realize, man, you know, the enemy wants to kill me, I better, you know, put my guard up. I better, you know, make sure that I don't fall into some of his traps or some of those agents of his that are trying to sway me. But even though you know, you're still tempted. Even though you're aware, you still kind of have this tendency to kind of like, well, you know, there's something there. It's crazy. And Delilah, just as bold as you can get, says, look, I want to know how to afflict you. I want to know how to get this power that you possess away from you so that we can afflict you. And here's what's interesting. Look at verse 8 or verse 7. And Samson said to her, if they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings, not yet dried, then I shall become weak and be like any other man. So the lords of the Philistines brought up to her 7 fresh bowstrings, not yet dried. They bound him with them. Now men were lying in wait, staying with her in the room, and she said to Samson, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he broke the bowstrings as a strand of yarn breaks when it touches fire. So the secret of his strength was not known. Now, Samson's playing with fire here. He thinks, you know what? I'm invincible. No one's ever going to trap me in that way. I can play around here. And even though he's aware Delilah's got it in for him, you know, she's going to be the instrument that's trying to trap him. He's still hanging out. You would think, you know, just a little bit of logic, you would think, okay, wait a second. She just tied me up with the fresh bowstrings that I just told her would take away my strength. She don't like me. She wants to kill me. She's got Philistines hiding under the couch, waiting for my demise. You would think at that point, Samson would go, okay, wait a second here. This isn't good. I better get out. But Samson believes that he's not going to get caught, that he's not going to get hurt, that there's not a consequence for his sin. And I think he believes it because he'd gotten away with a sin so many times before. And he's taking God's grace and mistaking it for God's approval. He's taking God's grace, and God didn't give him what he deserved the first time and the second time and the third time. That God was waiting for Samson to come to his senses and say, God, I don't want to live like this anymore. I don't want to live in rebellion to anymore. I don't want to continue in this sin any longer. But Samson never comes to his senses, and Samuel just keeps doing the same thing, thinking that, God got me out of it last time, and God got me out of it the time before, and God got me out of the time before, and he'll get me out of it the next time. And so Samson keeps flirting with sin. Notice the next verse. Verse 13. And Delilah said to Samson, until now, sweetie pie, you've mocked me. You've told me lies. Tell me what you may be bound with. And he said to her, if you weave the 7 locks of my head into the web of a loom. So she wove it tightly with a batten of the loom and said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he awoke from his sleep, and he pulled out the batten and the web from the loom. And she said to him, how can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? And guys, here's what kind of fascinates. You see, Samson, for the first time, just bind me with the fresh strings. This time, if you weave my hair in a loom, he's just getting a little bit closer. Now it's not just binding his hands. Now it's weaving his hair just a little bit closer to revealing the covenant he had made with God. The Nazirite vow that he wasn't to cut his hair as a sign of being dedicated and separated to God. And he just kind of moves a little bit closer to that place where he's going to be blindsided by the enemy. And it seems as though, that's what sin does. Once you start to give into it, it just wants a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. I know that's true when you're drinking alcohol, right? You just start off just a couple of beers, and then it goes to a 6-pack, and then it's a 12-pack, and you really can't really get buzzed until you're drinking, the keg. Because that's how the enemy, he just draws you in. Those that are using heroin, starts off with you just start with a little bit, and then your habit has to get a little bit more in order for you to get that same high, and then you got to use a little bit more. And the enemy just does it. He just kind of draws you in slowly, and then he just begins to put his hooks into you, so that it's just now what you did before doesn't satisfy anymore. You got to take it a little bit further. Talk to men that have got hooked on pornography. And it starts out very, just very mild. And then the longer they're doing it, the more hardcore the pornography has to be in order for them to get that same high. That's how the enemy works. He just wants you to, just a little bit more. And you think, at first it's fun. It's fun. It's just, it's just innocent. It's really not hurting anybody. But you just stick around for a little while, and it's not long before now you need to take it a little bit further over the edge to have that same satisfaction, that same gratification. Samson's flirting with sin, and he's giving a little more away every time. He's giving a little more away of God's hand upon him and God's anointing upon him. Now she's weaving his hair. He's able to take it out, like nothing. But notice the next step there. She comes back. She says, "How can you say, Samson, that you love me when your heart is not with me? Have I not and have not told me where your great strength lies?" And it came to pass, when she pestered him daily with her words and pressed him so that his soul was vexed to death, that he told her all of his heart. And he said to her, "No razor has ever come upon my head, for I have been a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb. If I am shaven, then my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man." Wow. You see, it was that progression. And she was able to persuade him. Now, it's interesting how she does it. She goes, you're just mocking me. If you really loved me, Samson, if you really cared about me, then you would tell me how to kill you. Doesn't that sound ridiculous? But it's exactly what the enemy does. It's exactly how he works. There's no secret about it. This isn't some, you didn't even see it coming. No, you see it coming. You think it's not going to happen to you, though. If you really love me, you'll tell me how to destroy your life, to make you a mockery, to get you outside of the will of God. And so Samson, it says she was nagging him. Guys will do crazy things so that they don't get nagged. It's all right, just don't nag me again, I'll do it. Right? And that's where Samson was. If I can get her to stop nagging, I'll just tell her everything. And he did. Verse 18. And when Delilah saw that he had told her all his heart, she sent and called for the lords of the Philistines, saying, "Come up once more, for he's told me all of his heart." And the lords of the Philistines came up to her and brought the money in their hands, and she lulled him to sleep on her knees. Wow. Guys, that's the next step in the enemy's ploy, the enemy's plot. He just lulls you to sleep so that you don't even see it coming. Just, get to the point where, I'm comfortable in my sin. I'm comfortable sitting here doing what I know God told me not to do. And somehow I'm even lying on Delilah's lap, and she's lulling me to sleep so that, I'm able to be shaved, ripped from the vow that I made to God. And it's exactly what takes place. She lulls him to sleep. It's interesting that she lulls him to sleep there on her knees, called for a man and had him shave off the 7 locks of his head, and she began to torment him. She began to torment him. She was so convinced of it this time that she even wakes up Samson at this point and just starts to torment Samson. The same one that said that she loved him and wanted his love to be, demonstrated to her is the very one tormenting him. I understand something, guys. This enemy doesn't care about you. He wants to torment you. He wants to mock you. And he's sitting there saying, oh, just a little bit more. Oh, you'll have fun. Just, come and do this. And then as soon as he's got you in his grasp, then he begins to torment you. It's crazy. And Delilah torments him. Check this out. And his strength left him. And she said, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. So he awoke from his sleep and he said, I'll go out as before at other times and shake myself free. But he did not know that the Lord had departed from him. Guys, that is one of the most grievous passages in the Bible. You see, Samson thought, you know what? It's just like every other time. I'll get up and I'll go and start whooping on some Philistines. And he didn't even know that the Spirit of God had departed from him. There's a line. God will show grace after grace after grace. But there's a line you can cross where God will say, okay, if that's what you want to do, then go for it. But I can't be part of it with you anymore. And no one knows where that line is. You don't know when you finally get to that point where God says, okay, enough is enough. I'm now going to let you go and do and suffer the consequences of your choices. That's why it's better not to get close to the line. It's better not get, walk on the edge. Because you don't know when that one wind will come and blow you over the edge. The goal for our Christian life is to say, God, I don't want to get as far as the edge as I can. I don't want to be in that area of compromise in my life. I don't want to be where the enemy can just start wearing me down and starting me down this path where I'm going to one day just be so blinded that I can't even recognize that I'm in this condition. You see, and we're going to read it here shortly, they're going to pluck out Samson's eyes. But let me tell you something. He was blind way before they plucked out his eyes. He was blind to the wiles of the enemy long before he lost his physical eyesight. And it's amazing because that passage there where he says, and he didn't even know that the Lord had departed from him. Can you imagine you just going through life and you don't even realize that at some point I crossed a line where God's not even here. God's not even working in my life anymore. God's not even part of what I'm doing any longer. That's where Samson was. And it says there in verse 21, and the Philistines took Samson. They put out his eyes. And they brought him down to Gaza. They bound him with bronze fetters. And he became a grinder in the prison. Wow. What a sad condition to be in. You see, a grinder was someone, is really an animal's job. They would tie a mule or an ox, and they would just take that ox, and he would just kind of walk in circles, and there would be a big millstone in the middle, and he was using that millstone to grind the wheat or the oil or the different kinds of harvest that they would bring in. And Samson there, blind, bald, tied to a piece of wood, walking in circles. And that was his existence. becoming the laughing stock of all of Gaza. The Philistines sitting there just celebrating their victory over Samson. Tells us in verse 23. Now the lords of the Philistines gathered together to offer great sacrifice to Dagon, their god, and to rejoice. And they said, our God has delivered into our hands Samson, our enemy. I mean, notice what's happening. The enemy celebrating Samson's demise. There's an interesting thought there that guys, if you're walking with the Lord, you become a trophy for the devil. You become someone that he rejoices when you fall or when you stumble or when you get trapped into sin. Remember David, King David? David had so many victories over the Philistines in his life. But he, like Samson, fell into sexual sin. He took Bathsheba. He was out on his balcony one day and he saw this woman bathing from his balcony. Went and called her to his room. It was another man's wife, a man by the name of Uriah. Was one of his soldiers. And he goes and he sleeps with her that night and then sends her away. She comes back a few days later and says, King David, I need to tell you something. I'm pregnant. And so David calls her husband Uriah off the battlefield to come home, thinking that if Uriah sleeps with her, then he'll think that it's his baby and then he'll be off the hook. Uriah never goes home. He said, you know what, how can I go sleep with my wife and all of our men are in the battlefield? And he falls asleep at the palace rather than go home to his wife. Loyal man. David's going, man, what am I going to do? He says, I know what I'll do. I'll get him drunk and then for sure he'll go home. Sleep with his wife. He gets him drunk and he passes out. Never makes it home. And so David writes a letter to his chief commander and he says, this is what you're going to do. You're going to go into the heat of the battle. You're going to put all of them at the front of the battle and Uriah's going to be at the front and then you're going to pull away and you're going to let Uriah die. David thought that he got away with his sin. The baby comes. David marries Bathsheba, thinking that, you know what, no one knows anything, everything's cool. And then the prophet Samuel comes and he talks to David. He says, hey, David, I got a little story for you. See, there was a man. He had this one little ewe lamb, and this little ewe lamb was like his daughter. He cared for that little ewe lamb. And he just loved that little ewe lamb. It, slept in his house. It was his best friend. And there was a rich man. He had herds. And he had visitors one night. And rather than taking one of his little lambs to feed his company, he took the poor man's lamb, and he offered it to his family. And David was furious. He says, I can't believe that. Who is that guy? He should die. That was so cruel, so unethical. That was so it looked so horrible. And Samuel says, David, you're that man. You took another man's wife. You had all the women to choose from, and you took another man's wife, and then you killed that man. You see, David's sin was exposed. And it cost him. It tells us in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 12. It's where that whole story's laid out. In 2 Samuel 12:12, it says this, "For you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all of Israel, before the sun." So David said to Nathan, "I have sinned against the Lord." And Nathan said to David, "The Lord also has put away your sin. You shall not die." Look at verse 14. This is what, I was saying Samuel the whole time. It was Nathan the prophet that was doing that. In verse 14 it says this, "However, because by this deed you've given great occasion to enemies of the Lord to blaspheme." And that verse always struck me. Because of what you did, David, you've given the enemies of God an occasion to blaspheme the Lord. You become the laughingstock. You're supposed to be the man who's walking with God, the man after God's own heart, and you're out there living this double life. Sexually perverted. Sexually out there sleeping with someone that's not your wife. And that's exactly what's happening to Samson. He gave the enemies of God an occasion to blaspheme. They're over there rejoicing because they defeated, and they're giving the credit to that to their god Dagon. And watch this. Look at verse 24. "And when the people saw him, they praised their God, and they said, 'Our God is delivered into our hands, our enemy, the destroyer of our land, and the one who multiplied our dead.' And so it happened, when their hearts were merry, and they said, 'Call for Samson, that he may perform for us.' And they called for Samson from the prison, and he performed for them. They stationed him between the pillars. And Samson said to the lad who led him by the hand, 'Let me feel the pillars which support the temple, so that I can lean on them.' And the temple was full of men and women. All the lords of the Philistines were there, about 3,000 men and women on the roof, watching while Samson performed. And Samson called to the Lord." Now, it's interesting that Samson had been in this condition for some time. They're celebrating, and I told this earlier. I think we missed that verse 22, where it says, "However, the hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaved." Samson's hair starting to grow back. So that would tell us, there's been a little bit of time that's lapsed here. And for the first time, it tells us Samson cries out to the Lord. Only 2 times in Samson's story, 3 chapters, does he pray. One time because he's dying of thirst. "Lord, just kill me. I'm so thirsty that if you don't give me water, I'm going to die." Samson, a little bit of a drama queen. And here, for the second time in his story, we find Samson cries out to the Lord. And as he cries out to the Lord this time, notice what happens. He said, "Oh Lord God, remember me, I pray. Strengthen me, I pray, just this once, O God, that I may with one blow take vengeance on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." And Samson took hold of the 2 middle pillars which supported the temple. He braced himself against them, one on his right and the other on his left. And Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." And he pushed with all of his might, and the temple fell on the lords and all the people who were in it. So the dead that he killed at his death were more than he had killed in his life. Wow. It's interesting that and I think the question comes up, well, what, why did God allow Samson to take his own life? Isn't that suicide? No, let me tell you what was happening here. Samson was called to destroy Philistines. That's what his purpose was. That's what he was, created for. He was to be a deliverer of Israel. And if Samson would have died to his flesh, he wouldn't have had to die in this condition. But because his flesh dictated to him, that Samson now is going to die in his physical being. And I think there's something to that for us, guys. God wants to use your life for His glory. But you have to die to yourself. Because as long as you allow self to rule, then God can't rule. It's when you die to yourself that God can use you for His kingdom, for His glory. Now, what is interesting is that Samson here is still considered a man of faith. Sometimes I don't even get it. To be quite honest with you, I kind of read you turn to Hebrews chapter 11, and that's kind of like listing all the men of faith, Abraham and Gideon, and this long list of men that God used, and it says Barak and Samson and Jephthah and David and Samuel and the prophets. Now, he's put in the list of long men that God used. And it's incredible because you kind of like, that's not a man of faith. That's a guy who didn't walk by faith. But that's not how God viewed Samson. It's crazy. You see, God had a call in his life. He had a purpose for Samson. Now, Samson, at the end, repents. And what I find fascinating about God is that God was there to grace him again. God never gave up on Samson, even to to his final breath. God was still waiting for Samson to come to this point in his life where he says, okay, God, I give my life to you. I surrender it. I want to die to myself. Samson literally dies. But he didn't have to go this path. He didn't have to go that route. God had so much more for this man. And God's grace is so amazing. So up until your last breath, he's there with open arms waiting. He's just waiting. Now, you can follow Samson's path. Keep flirting with sin. Keep playing around thinking, no, I'm never going to get caught. And, and you just get deeper and deeper and deeper. And then, it gets to the point where God's got to say, all right, that's what you want to do. Go for it. There's going to be consequences. Your eyes are going to get plucked out. Doesn't mean that God gave up on you. It means that God says, I can no longer participate with you. But anytime you're ready to come back, I'm right here. Anytime you're ready to finally get on your knees and say, God, I give, I'm right here. That's the heart of God. And I think Samson becomes, man, what a picture. his brother's father's house, came down, carried him between Zorah and Paul in the tomb of his father Manoah, and he judged Israel. There's Samson's story. From birth to death. We had it all, in a few short chapters. How much of it we didn't even get touched on. I mean, we missed so much. All the in-between details of Samson's life. But I think, really, guys, the application for us is that there's a story. And what's that story going to be? You may have blown it a long way. It's not too late. It's never too late. To just finally to say, okay, anymore. I want to surrender. I want to give my life completely over. And let me close here. In 2 Corinthians chapter 13, Paul, I think, lays it out so perfectly in 2 Corinthians 13:5. He says this. He says in 2 Corinthians 13:5, he says, examine yourself as to whether you're in the faith. Test yourselves. Do you not know yourself that Jesus Christ is in you? Unless indeed you're disqualified, but I trust that you will know that you are not disqualified. Watch what he says. And I pray to God that you do no evil. Not that you should appear approved, but that you should do what is honorable, though you may seem disqualified. Now here's what Paul is saying. Look, do a self-evaluation. Really examine yourself, whether you're really walking in faith, whether you're really living the life of faith. That's a good thing to do. Just take an examination of your life and say, you know what, am I just playing a game? Am I just going through the motions? Am I sitting there flirting with sin week after week and month after month, and I think that there's never going to be a consequence for that? That's examining yourself. But then he says, look, don't you know that Jesus Christ is in you? I mean, consider that. That Jesus Christ is in you. And he wants to accomplish things in your life, but he can't do it as long as you're in the driver's seat. He can only do it when you surrender and say, God, you take over. And that's where Samson never got until the end. It was too late for him to have any lasting effect. I appreciate that at least he did it. On his deathbed, but he did it. But it just such an incredible warning for us. And for me, it's an encouragement. Just like, man, I just watched a man's life in 3 chapters. I watched a man's life. And that's not the kind of life I want to live. That's not the path I want to take. And may that be something we consider